Shiga Yugo Quendish and Cause my Inganando them. Homa Minishnabe Quendao. Gayeta Shaw, Midewana Quendao. And we Shagana Shimajina. Gayeta Shaw Giganzibi and Donjiba. I want to first acknowledge the land of my Indigenous relatives and all of the ancestors who walked this beautiful land, and ensured that all of their grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, 7 generations into the future would still be walking this land and caring for this part of the world for all of us. My English name is Mary Deleary. I introduce myself in my Anishinaabe language, my spirit name, my clan family. I belong to the Wolf clan, and I am Algonquin Anishinaabe. I come from my original homeland is in the east, in the community of that's a reserve boundary. I come from the eastern lands. My people, our territory actually stemmed from the shores of the St. Lawrence all the way up, into the Ottawa River area. And so that's where I come from. I work for Thunderbird Partnership Foundation as relayed, and I'm going to be sharing our exciting research project with you. I know it's the end of the day, and I think that everyone needs to be saluted. Because it is a long day, and and I appreciate that you're here, still here with us this afternoon. So I'm going to be talking to you about a research undertaking by Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and I'm so used to it's really difficult for me to be standing here behind this podium, mostly because I can hardly see over it, but also because it's really difficult for me to stand still when I'm talking. So this is a real test. So I'll just have to do it. But I'm going to be talking about a research that we undertook, Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and it was funded through the CIHR. And the title of it is Culture as Intervention. And this research project, I think we started the undertaking in 2012, and we had partners. We partnered with the University of Saskatchewan. We partnered with CAMH. With the Assembly of First Nations and with Health Canada, and a number of academic researchers from various universities also participated. Most importantly, our treatment centers, our NADAP adult treatment centers on First Nations communities, and our youth treatment centers in First Nations communities were part of the research and contributed to the research, formed the research base, and provided the culture as foundation information. So this is sort of the outline, I guess. So I'm going to be talking about the research project, the Indigenous Knowledge as Evidence and Indigenous Wellness Framework, and sorry about that, the Native Wellness Assessment, which is one of the tools that, and was the actual focus of the research. So in terms of background, I already gave you some of that in terms of who our partners were, and the treatment centers, as I said, who formed our foundation base for research as the Indigenous as our Indigenous group. Because if I don't know how many of you are familiar with NADAP in the room and YSAP, or so the NADAP is a National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program. That spans back quite a number of years now. I think it was the late 1980s, maybe early 1980s, and out of the NADAP, which is funded through Health Canada, developed the adult treatment centers across the country, and then later youth treatment centers across the country, and as the treatment centers developed their programs. What became evident in the programs was as they introduced culture, as they introduced cultural practices, cultural interventions, elders, knowledge keepers, practitioners, community supports in relation to the treatment centers, that they had really good outcomes in terms of treatment. And that held the same true for youth treatment centers. And so for Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, that's not a surprise to us. But we wanted to be able to show that, as an evidence base, because we know that culture works in terms of treating addictions, but also just in terms of moving towards healing and wellness for Indigenous peoples in whatever challenges they have and that we have. So what do we know? We know the destructive impacts of colonization on the determinants of First Nations health. And, and we know the impacts in terms of substance misuse and addictions. But we also know, so we're so used to seeing everything from a deficit lens, the bad news story for First Nations people, which are part of our reality because of colonization and assimilation tactics and everything that has happened. But the other truth is, and what we also know, is that we have incredible strengths. We have an incredible lineage on Turtle Island, what we call our homeland here. And from that, we have our stories. We have our stories all the way back to creation time in all of our nations. And we have our strong values and we have our beautiful languages. We have incredibly strong families. And we have a connection with this land that nurtures us always. So we know all of our strengths. So we know that, we know the role that our strengths, our cultural strengths need to play in healing from problematic substance misuse, to addictions, to mental wellness issues, physical wellness issues, all of that. And so that was when we were looking at this research and what we would be undertaking, we said we have all of the anecdotal stories. And stories are really important to us as Indigenous peoples. But we have all the anecdotal stories out of treatment centers, from NAIDAP workers in First Nations communities, about all the ways that cultural interventions and cultural practices promoted wellness and made a difference, not just for the individual, but for their families and for their communities. And so we know that's our truth, and we know that our practices are what we need to maintain and strengthen. So, well, how do we, and we want to be able to show that beyond the anecdotal stories. And there must be a way that we can do that. And we want to create an assessment that's a strength-based cultural wellness assessment that speaks to how, when we utilize our culture in pursuing wellness, that there is a difference and we can measure it. And so as I said, we had a number of partners to do that. So that's what our goal was. The aim of the research project is to build a culturally specific evidence base for demonstrating the impact of Indigenous culture in facilitating wellness. So this presentation, we're just going to provide a quick overview of that process, highlight some of the aspects of the research, particularly the Indigenous Wellness Framework and the Native Wellness Assessment, and also to keep stressing that Indigenous knowledge was prioritized throughout the process of synthesizing the information shared by treatment centers and actually the assessment tool itself. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this two-eyed seeing approach, but the CASI team, which is the Culture as Intervention research team, adopted this approach, saying this will be the approach we work with, because we took an approach where our Indigenous elder, Elder Jim Dumont, he was the lead researcher on this project. It was the first time that there was an Indigenous elder who was the lead researcher, and so as I said, we had a number of other researchers. We had our researchers from the universities, but we also had our knowledge practitioners, our cultural knowledge practitioners who were part of that, as I said, and the staff at treatment centers who worked with the clients. So we had, so in that way, I was saying we were building an approach and saying this is going to be an Indigenous-led research process. And so when we are looking at this, we are going to be applying the tools of Western science, but from within our Indigenous worldview. And that will be the primary worldview. And so this process prioritized Indigenous methodologies and ways of knowing and knowledge. This is a picture, and I'm sure you can see everybody and be able to identify them. But This is the Cassie research team, or some of them. They're not all there. There was, as I said, there was quite a number of people involved throughout the 3-year research period in this. So a number of them are not there, but this was a second national gathering that we held to synthesize the knowledge that we had gathered from an environmental scan at treatment centers across the country. So Indigenous knowledge and evidence then, because we believe that, and we know it to be true. You know, we have our own understanding of evidence, and it's the same as anything. You have to be able to, you have to be able to prove it. It has to be able to work. You know, we're pretty darn good at evidence, I would say, because we've been here for hundreds of thousands of years and we've survived quite well. And we didn't do that without good evidence and good practice, and best practices. So, you know, so we have a good understanding of evidence from our worldview. And where do they reside? So our Indigenous knowledge and our cultural practices, you know, through all of the colonization attempts and that kind of colonization process, that still continues. Nora made reference to child welfare today, and you know, and that again is a process that impacts severely, and is part of the colonization process. Our children are still being apprehended at a rate that is unheard of, probably in any other part of the world. And so this is when we're talking about when we talk about impacts. It's not a past. It's not just the residential school. You know, and we somehow, that's not to say that wasn't an incredible period of time that continues to affect us intergenerationally. However, we have pre-residential school and we have post-residential school colonization impacts, and so we're aware of that. And, you know, so Indigenous knowledge, cultural practices, practitioners are critical. That's talking again about our cultural strengths, our ways of knowing, and that we still, even through all of that, and that speaks to us about the strength of our story, the strength of our knowing, our identity as a people, because we still have access. We still have access to our knowledge. We still have access to our stories. We still have access to our cultural practices. Even though they were outlawed for many, many years in this country and had to go underground. And yet we still have them. And they reside in our traditional lodges. And every nation of people have the most beautiful names in our sacred languages about those places where healing and wellness reside for our people. So, and I love this photo, this piece of artwork. This is a Norval Morrisall piece of artwork. You know, and I don't know if everybody in the room is familiar with Norval. If not, you should be. He's an incredible artist. Norval also struggled with addictions, alcohol addictions, for most of his life. And yet look at what he was able to create. He's a world-renowned Indigenous artist and a world-renowned artist. And his art speaks to us. His art speaks to us. Speaks to a spirit connection, because that is what he painted. He painted the stories shared with him through his grandparents. He shared the stories through his artwork of connection to land, of connection to our relatives and creation, of our connection to our spirit and where our wellness emanates from. And he struggled. And yet, as I said, at the same time that he struggled, he had access. He had access to knowledge that helped him and assisted him in being that great artist that he was, and to be able to share story through art that way, and to share Indigenous knowledge that way. And so Indigenous knowledge and culture, we know, are vital for healing. You know, we also know through this, we also knew in undertaking this research that empirical evidence was missing, and that our research project is the first of its kind in Canada to document a culturally competent evidence base, including the nature and effectiveness of engaging cultural interventions within treatment programs. And so I said, well, how was that Indigenous-led knowledge or Indigenous-led research project? How was that activated? It was, we did part of it. As I said, was all of the literature reviews were undertaken, as is the standard. But where we drew our research base from and our research knowledge from that we were going to create the assessment tool from was through conducting an environmental scan with 12 treatment centers, as I said, a combination of adult and youth treatment centers across Canada and First Nations communities. And in the first year, the environmental scan was conducted in the first year. And I'm going to have to put on my glasses. And that environmental scan was, as I said, led by Elder Jim Dumont. But it involved the 12 treatment centers, and in each treatment center, I said the staff participated, boards of, directors of the boards participated, community members who supported the treatment center in their activities, knowledge keepers, cultural knowledge keepers, elders in those communities, all participated in the environmental scan. And, and in that, it was also that at each treatment center, the environmental scan was conducted with the cultural protocols respecting the land and the nations of people, because when we're moving across Canada, we are speaking about that many distinct language groups, language families across Canada, that many different nations with their own unique cultural protocols, their own unique culture based upon the land they come from and the language they speak. And so at each treatment center then, the cultural protocols of that nation of people, of the land where the visit was taking place at the treatment center, all of that was respected, and it was respected through ceremonial protocol initiated by the treatment center. And then with that, Elder Jim Dumont then shared the Anishinaabe creation story. Jim Dumont is an Ojibwe Anishinaabe elder, and so he shared the creation story. That was the beginning of the environmental scan. And so we know, as I said, this was very much an Indigenous-led process, an Indigenous way of understanding. Our evidence base emanates from our creation stories. And so in that then, Elder Jim Dumont was able to guide and lead the sessions through engaging the whole being, through engaging a spiritual connection with all of those present, engaging that emotional heart connection, engaging that mind connection, so that they would be able to do what they were called there to do. So as I said, we know that for us, our creation stories hold our evidence base. That for us, knowledge given by the Spirit, our Creator, held in sacred societies and other sacred instruments, is accepted as truth by Indigenous people. Indigenous knowledge is the evidence base necessary for healing and wellness because it emphasizes the integration of physical and spiritual realities. And so, the Indigenous Wellness Framework then, and I already spoke about the many nations of people that were represented across the land by these 12 treatment centers, and having to respect that, and having to hear that in all of the ways that they express culture, because there's not just one Indigenous way of expressing culture. And so Indigenous First Nations voices said, and we know this to be true because I said all of these different nations and groups participated. And in that environmental scan then, there were 3 questions that were asked. What is a whole and healthy person? Because this was visioning towards wellness. So I said, we want to vision towards wellness, but if we're going to vision wellness, what does wellness look like? If we're going to move towards wellness, or we say we are moving towards wellness, we know that our cultural practices facilitate wellness. What does wellness look like? And how does Indigenous culture or Indigenous cultural practices facilitate wellness? And when we rely on culture to promote wellness, what should we expect the outcomes to be? And that was asked consistently across the 12 treatment centers, and they responded. And at every treatment center, a room like this would be covered and wrapped around by flip chart paper of all of the responses and ways that they answered this question in the work that they did from their evidence base. And synthesizing very, very briefly, an answer to what is a whole and healthy person and what is wellness from an Indigenous perspective. Well, it's a whole and healthy person expressed through a sense of balance of body, mind, emotion, and spirit. Central to wellness is belief in one's connection to language, land, beings of creation and ancestry, supported by a caring family and environment. And that, was just a very brief synopsis of all of the narratives that were shared. So the Indigenous Wellness Framework, when we're talking about the definition of wellness, we're looking at it from that balance. Of course, that's what all of the people said across the country, from whatever nation that they emerge from, said, that we need the balance of spirit, heart, mind, and body to be well. And that we know wellness then, we know the outcomes. When we have balance, the outcomes are hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. That an individual will have hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. That's the evidence and the outcomes when we are moving towards wellness. And so spiritual wellness is that quality of being alive. That spirit is central to the primary vision of life and worldview and thereby facilitates hope, because that was said consistently. Hope is needed, belief is needed. And that emotional wellness, what is the outcome of emotional wellness? Well, emotional wellness is nurtured by our belonging, interdependent relationships, including related to beings in creation, being rooted in family, community. Extended family is the foundation of belonging and relationships. Mental wellness, that our lives and when we know that our minds are moving and are well, that we have a well and good mind. Our Haudenosaunee Iroquois relatives, they always speak of the good mind. And that's what the good mind is, that there is meaning in life, and I have meaning in my life has meaning. And so mental wellness then is that, is the mind operates in both a rational and intuitive capacity, recognizing that there is a spiritual part of the mind. Having a reason for being gives us meaning to life. Physical wellness speaks to wholeness. And, and in this and in all of the responses that were given and the way that it was shared, the way that they could see the evidence is seeing and understanding that physical wellness is that way of behaving and doing that actualizes the intention and desire of the spirit in the world, because we know that first and foremost we are spiritual beings. That is our Indigenous worldview. This and the knowledge that the spirit has something to do in the world generates a sense of purpose. So in that then, so we know the outcomes. The outcomes, and what this whole and healthy person, the outcomes of facilitating wellness through culture is that we actually see the outcomes of hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose in a person's life, and that there's indicators. They also talked about all of the indicators. That when we utilize cultural interventions or cultural practices, what are they? And then what are the indicators of hope? And when that was asked, the indicators of hope were spoken of as belief first and foremost. Belief in our Creator. And that values are an indicator. And there is research that has been done over the years about in relation, of course, we've been researched, I don't like to say to death, but we've been researched to death. We have, well, I won't go there. But in some of that research, it's helpful to us, right? So and what's been said is that there's a core constellation of Indigenous values that survive through all of the colonization impacts and all of the assimilation policies that occur, that there's these core constellation of values. And we know it's true. We're the evidence. I'm the evidence. If you want evidence, I'm the evidence. All of us who are Indigenous people from Turtle Island are the evidence of that. And then identity. Of course, you know, and there's no surprise there in some ways. And what, you know, and what is it that makes up identity? You know, an identity is made up of our, first and foremost, from our language as Indigenous people, because we believe our language as Indigenous peoples to be a sacred language, and so and our spiritual identity given to us through our names. There's a naming protocol, cultural protocol in every nation. We have families. We describe them in different ways. In some nations, we describe them as our clan families, our extended families. We have a connection to more than human being, and there is lots in that about who we are. And you know, so, and then you know, when we think about the Truth and Reconciliation, we think about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and most recently the Truth and Reconciliation. You know, there is in calls for action 13 through 15 is all about language and the importance of language in relation to our identity and wellness. And then you know, and there is even another call for action that talks about names in relation to our identity. Because many of our children, especially when they were taken to residential school, but pre-residential school in the treaty era, you know, and when you know, and when the reservation systems were put into place, you know, that Indian agents at the time would just, you know, oh, so you're so and so now, you're John Smith, you know, because couldn't say our Anishinaabe names, made no, you know, could not make any sense of that to them, so they just assigned a name. And then with the residential school era, it was the very same thing. Children would arrive at the school with their spirit names, with their identity intact. You know, and along with the stripping of everything also was the stripping of their name. So the calls for action, number 17, is to allow us to find our original names, our original family names, and reinstate those. You know, so that's all part of this. And and then, you know, in belonging, and when Nora was sharing about, you know, about opiate replacement therapy and what is happening in Northwestern Ontario, and in there you see all about belonging that facilitates, you know, all of the indicators that facilitate belonging. There's family connection, there's community connection, you know, there in one of these communities. And it's amazing. But when they were going for their first induction, that the community, and you know, and as the group was identified who would be the first, the community held a community feast. They held a community feast in honor of them. That's belonging. That facilitates wellness and connection. That's relationship. The land-based programs that accompany the, you know, the opiate replacement therapies, the land-based programs that are also in many of our treatment centers, you know, that's that connection and relationship to land and other beings of creation. That's connecting us back. That's where our wellness emanates from. We have to connect to where we come from, and the land is so important to that for us. You know, that's what helps us to have that attitude about living life. To continue to live life, because I belong. Because I belong in this creation, and I know who I am in this creation. And I have family, and they may not be my blood family, you know, but I've often said, and I have, you know, I left my community. I left my community when I was 16 years old, and so, you know, and I have a very large family. I have a whole community. But so when I left home, everywhere I went, my first task was to create my family, to create my extended family. And I found them everywhere. And that goes on today. And so that's how important that is. And knowing that, just knowing that intuitively, I knew that if I was going to survive as a young person, that I needed to find my family. And I needed to create my family and have that. That's what was nurturing for me. You know, and then we talk about meaning in life and where do we find that? And for us as Indigenous people, and again, we look at the calls to action. Look at calls to action number 45. And it says that there needs to be a royal proclamation on reconciliation in Canada. And in that, it's talking all about that we need to know again, and so do all of our relatives in Canada who have come to live here and make this their home, through some for more recently, some through many generations, need to know who the Indigenous people are and the true story, our story. You know, I had a man that I respected so much, and his name was Art Solomon. He was an incredible activist. He was a beautiful man. He's left this world, he's walked on, he's gone home. You know, but he used to say, you know, those history books, they talk about his story. We need our story, and we need to tell our story. And so, you know, those calls to action are also speaking about that. That's what will help to provide meaning in life again for our young people, our children, so that they're not push-outs in the school system. Because our children are not dropouts, our children are push-outs. And because there is no meaning there for them. And we also, you know, when we're talking about the mind, we also talk about the spiritual mind. That we know and believe that our mind is also communicated from our spirit being. And that we have great respect for that. And that's what helps to provide meaning in our life as well, through dreams. Through, you know, what people call intuition, all kinds of ways that you can describe that. And then when we're talking about purpose and our physical layer of being, it's the outermost layer of our being. It's what activates us and helps us to celebrate life and be who we are and do, so that we have wholeness in our life. So this, in a very brief way, is the Indigenous Wellness Framework. That was one of the outcomes of the research, and is what the Native Wellness Assessment measures. It measures the outcomes of hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. In the Native Wellness Assessment, these 13 indicators, there are questions, there are statements that are related to each one of these indicators and to the cultural practices that support them. So these are the common cultural interventions. I keep promising to change this because I can't handle the word common. But in this context, because common, you know what I mean? I don't want it to be understood as every day. Common means those ones that were held in common, because we did this research with so many nations of people, as I said, who have their own distinct, unique practices in how they celebrate and celebrate culture, and how they utilize cultural interventions in healing and wellness. That because we're going to create a measurement tool, we had to come to one mind about what practices that we have in common that we can measure, that we all utilize in our healing and wellness programs in these treatment centers. So, you know, and so the premise of this is that these cultural interventions, first and foremost, they respect diversity of cultures. They're based on common cultural practices. They identify Indigenous language as central to knowledge, sanctioning, and practice. And whether cultural interventions are practiced within a residential treatment center or in a community-based service, community is involved. Because for us, that is central to healing as well. So, you know, as I said, throughout this 3-year process, and synthesizing and bringing it back, because again, that's respect, that this is not our knowledge, this is the knowledge that belongs to the people. Belongs to the people who share this knowledge. And we have to respect that and honor that. And so we would always bring the conversation back to them and say, is this right? Is this right? Is this correct? And so we came to agreement, you know, over that period of time, of those practices that we may not all do in exactly the same way, that we may not all conduct in exactly the same way, but we have them as a practice. So that language, of course, was central. That we all have creation stories and origin stories that source our evidence. That we have traditional teachings, that we have talking circles, that we have cleansing ceremonies, that we have social dances, you know, that we have storytelling. All of those things that we can say, yes, we all have those. So those were the common cultural interventions. And this was then, I said that all of that information and that 3 years of environmental scans within those treatment centers are what provided all of the information necessary for the Native Wellness Assessment. And the Native Wellness Assessment is the first instrument of its kind to measure the effect of cultural interventions on a person's wellness from a whole person and strength-based perspective. It is statistically and psychometrically validated as a reliable measure of change and wellness over time across all genders, age groups, and cultures. The Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, we provide the NWA to communities, to treatment centers, to organizations that utilize Indigenous culturally based programs, because of course that's what it's relevant to, and to measure the impact of culture and wellness. So this tool actually was completed in 2015. We began, that was pilot tested, and then we began to share it. And now, as time has gone on, that we are seeing that there are many other uses that communities and organizations are finding for the Native Wellness Assessment, for program evaluation, for program design, for cultural competency, for staff, for many, many things. So so what does the Native Wellness Assessment help us with? It helps us to tell our story from our own evidence, hope for their future and those of their families that are grounded in a sense of identity, Indigenous values, having a connection to Indigenous worldview, a sense of belonging, again, connected with family to community, and an attitude towards living, a sense of meaning that is created by Indigenous knowledge and from the accumulation of education, a purpose in their daily lives, whether it is through education, employment, caregiving activities. Again, that's grounded in cultural ways of being and doing. The Native Wellness Assessment itself is made up of two assessment forms. It's the self and observer forms, and can be completed twice or 3 times in a program cycle, a treatment cycle. We have all of the information on this, on the Native Wellness Assessment, on our website, and you can access the information there for organizations who are interested in utilizing the Native Wellness Assessment. The information to do that and the contact information is also on our website. So I encourage you, if you are interested, to check out our website. We also have a booth here, and I think there's still a few hard copies of the Native Wellness Assessment at our booth. They're still there. I don't know how long they'll last. So as I said, we began to share the assessment by early 2016, and we've created. Now we have some data. It's very early data because we have use of the assessment at our adult treatment centers through a national database that we utilize in our treatment centers. So we have some initial data that way for adult treatment centers as well as youth treatment centers. I need my glasses again. This just gives a snapshot of for 2016-17 in adult treatment centers in terms of the types of substance use that was showing upon intake. You can see that alcohol is very high, tobacco is very high, and also opioids and stimulants are still very high. And then with the Indigenous Wellness assessment and some of those results, we're able to see from this initial data that and these are 28-day treatment cycles, on average. So in that treatment cycle, there was a 13% increase, pretty much overall, for adults through cultural interventions and cultural practices within the treatment center, and that's what the Native Wellness Assessment is showing. And then for Indigenous youth, the Indigenous youth treatment centers for First Nations, and I believe there's still 10 of them. Am I correct, Yvonne? I'm looking at Yvonne. Yvonne is the executive director for Siksika, which is a youth treatment center here in Alberta. And so there are 10 treatment centers, and they pretty much, I think they all are now on 3-month cycles, pretty much 3-month treatment cycles. Oh. And Siksika is 4. Okay, so I believe maybe they are 4. So 4-month treatment cycles, and again, the Native Wellness Assessment, where it was utilized at treatment centers and seeing the results nationally, a little bit about 10-11% increases across hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose within treatment centers. For youth, we can see marijuana use very, very high, presenting at intake. That tobacco use, alcohol are still what are the substances that are being utilized by youth. And marijuana, especially with cannabis legalization, we can see why it is of great interest and concern for First Nations communities, because at 95% for females. And then the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. And the reason that this ends my presentation is because you can see at the center of the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework, you see hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. That the process of the regional dialogues and the national dialogues that developed the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework paralleled the time frame of our development of the Indigenous Wellness Framework and the Native Wellness Assessment. And when our Indigenous Wellness Framework was presented to the planning group that were developing the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework, they said, those are the outcomes for the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. And so you see them here. And the key themes for the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework, which is also our mandate for Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, is culture as foundation, community development and ownership, quality health systems and competent service delivery, collaboration with partners, and enhanced flexible funding investments. And Carol, our Executive Director, Carol Hopkins, did a wonderful presentation on the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework yesterday. So I'm hoping some of you heard that. We also have these resources on our website. And I think that concludes my presentation. Miigwech, thank you.